Hello, everybody, and welcome to The Broken Banquet, a podcast about missions. We are your hosts, Will Bailey and Dr. Ashley Goad, and we are so glad that you have joined us for another conversation about the church and missions, about what healthy mission relationships can look like, and as we hear from others who have dedicated their lives in one way or another to mission work. We're so glad you're here, and we hope you enjoy this episode. Hey, Ashley, how are you?
Fine, Will. How are you?
I'm good. Hey, you remember that time that we interviewed Nate Hutchison?
I do remember that time.
And he mentioned this guy named Hamish Taylor.
Oh, yeah, I remember him too.
You remember that time we interviewed Nate and Whitney Hutchison?
I do remember that time as well.
And they also mentioned this guy, Hamish Taylor?
I remember that too.
Well, do you remember that time we interviewed Hamish Taylor?
Oh, it was a good day.
That was a good one. I hope you remember it. You were in the room with him at the time. So
It was a very good day. We shared a mic. It was great.
yeah, I think we should let people hear from Hamish Taylor.
Let's do it.
Here we go.
Your friend and mine, Hamish Taylor.
So how are you, Ashley?
You know, I'm pretty great. I wrote a sermon today. I feel really good about that. I've had Hamish and Molly here, and that's made me really happy.
Good. Good.
I'm not sure why, but I appreciate that.
Well, we've had a really good trip, I think.
I've had a good trip.
Okay, I've had a good time y'all being here.
See, I brought my children, so I just don't understand how anyone else in the room has a good trip.
Oh, no, they're so good. We've been having a good time. So, I don't know if you know how I know Hamish, but here's how I know Hamish. So once upon a time, I met a guy named John Woodward, and we've had him on the podcast before, and
Multiple times.
And he is the executive director for South Pacific Christian Fellowship. And one day, a guy named Nate Hutchison was riding around in the southern part of the United States with his dad.
As you do.
And stopped through Shreveport, Louisiana. And that's when Nate and I knew that we were going to be friends for life. Well, then John Woodward and I and a group from First United Methodist went over to Auckland, New Zealand, and it happened to be on the very first weekend
I believe so, yeah.
that that was the next year.
Yes, I believe so.
And so we met this group of people that were thinking about planting.
We probably
a
should have got
church.
a story straight before we started, but that's all
probably
right.
should have done that, yeah. So in 2018, I went to Auckland, New Zealand for the very first time with John Woodward. And while we were there, we ran into Nate and Whitney Hutchison, and they were working at Shore Community Church.
That's right.
And it was after they had just finished a church plant in Christchurch, and they were taking some time off. And they said, you have to meet these great people. Their names are Hamish and Molly. They're part of our church plant team. And so we did. I think we might have had dinner.
I believe so. Yes, my memory from that particular stage of my life was a little bit hazy because that was before we got started in this new church plant, and I was coming out of burnout from the previous church plant, so it's a fog.
I remember going with Nate to Hobsonville.
Okay.
Is it Hobsonville?
Mm-hmm.
And looking at the place where he was praying over planting a church.
Right.
And so the next year, y'all had planted Church Northwest, and it was your very first Sunday worship service.
Yes, that was 2 years later, actually.
Oh, was it?
Yeah, I wasn't even involved in the project at that point.
Oh.
He was just praying over it. He was praying over me that I would get back into the game. And I was, I think, praying the opposite. And then God listened to him instead of me. And so we got started about a year later is when we sort of bought into the idea of the church plant. And then a year after that, that's when you came back and we were just getting started.
Can I just say one of the things that I've learned about Ashley, I think maybe just over the course of doing this podcast, is that the people that she really feels a deep connection to are people who her first meeting with them either involved going for a walk, having drinks, or food.
Mm.
So what I want to say to our listeners out there, any of you who at any point in your lives find yourselves either going for a walk, having a drink, or sharing a meal with Ashley, just be prepared, because you are probably at the beginning of what's going to be a very long and wonderful friendship with Ashley Goad. Just
Yeah, absolutely.
that's one takeaway at least of the Broken Banquet.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure Ashley has met a person she hasn't loved completely and utterly. He's looking at me like maybe she has met some people, and now I'm wondering if I'm that person. But no, that's okay.
There was a time when I felt like being in that club of these are people that I love. These are people that Ashley loves. I thought that's like, yeah, we're in. What I've realized is
No, that's
there's a
human.
lot of people in that
Yeah.
club.
Yeah,
But I
get that
also know
impression
there are some people who aren't in the club.
Okay, all right. Well, I have not met such people yet, but I also know that it's not just a passing thing. It's a deep and genuine love for people.
That is for sure.
Very Christ-like, I would imagine, actually.
Okay, well, enough about me.
So is that a wrap? Are we done for the day?
Yeah, I think so. I think that was good.
Okay. All right, another one in the bag. Thanks, guys. So I'm sick, by the way. I've been on multiple really fast trips to the United States over the last like month and a half, and have dodged the bullet every time until this last one. And I'm just going to blame it on somebody that I sat next to on a plane. And about 2 days after I got home, I just started feeling really, really crummy. So I feel the best today that I felt since like last Thursday. So usually I blame poor sound quality on just my being in Central America. Today I'm going to blame it on the fact that I can't breathe out of my nose.
You could do both.
And I may be a little slow on the uptake today, but
You're the better interviewer of the two of us, so I would say you start and then I'll jump in.
okay.
He is.
I mean, I'm not going to fight with you about that, Ashley. I'll just go with it. I'm going to be easy to get along with today.
Oh, nice.
So Hamish, actually the first time I heard about you was on the retreat that Ashley took us on earlier this year to Italy with a bunch of other missionary families, and had a really, really good conversation with Nate, who's already come up today, about the church planting efforts in New Zealand, and your name came up a couple of times. And so I'm excited.
I'm sorry for whatever he said. I'm sorry.
Well, that's why we wanted to have you on, is so that you could actually defend yourself.
Yeah.
Because it was pretty slanderous and scandalous. No, not at all. Obviously, you're kind of in a unique situation. I don't know if you could maybe tell us a little bit of your background.
Sure.
You're a New Zealander. You sound a little bit like a New Zealander, but not as much like a New Zealander as I might have expected. So can you help our listeners understand a little bit your background and sort of what your journey into church planting in New Zealand has been?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, I'm born and raised in New Zealand, and so I spent most of my life in Auckland, New Zealand, where I'm at now. And I was part of a church plant when I was 13, and I believe this Shore Community Church has popped up on this podcast before in relation to our church. And so that's the church I really I was a Christian my whole life, but that's where faith really came alive for me, is this church plant. And it was planted by an American group, actually by South Pacific Christian Fellowship, back in 95. And so when I was 16 years old and God said to me, hey, you don't want to be a fighter pilot, you should be a preacher. And I was like, okay. And so that's what I decided to do with my life. And so I went to the preacher of the church, and he suggested that I might want to go to the States for Bible college. I was like, okay, sure, sounds great. We love getting out of our country. And that's one of the traits of New Zealanders, is that we're pretty desperate to leave. At least for a couple of years after high school. It's a small country. It's beautiful. We love it, but it's like cabin fever. You know, you get to about 18, 19, it's like, we're going to bail out for a little bit. So we usually travel the world. Well, I got my education at the same time, so that was a pretty good deal. And so I went over to the States, where I went to Cincinnati Bible College, which is no longer in existence, but it was a lovely Bible college. I enjoyed my time there, and I met my wonderful wife there, so that was pretty good. And then I sort of changed my accent a little bit while I was there. I was there for 4 years, and I was going around talking like a Kiwi, and everyone was like, "What were you saying? What was that? I don't understand what you said." Or they'd ask me to say, "Hey, can you say aluminium? Ooh, what is a can made out of?" And so I'm like, "Okay, this is fine. It's good. The accent helped me get my lady, so I'm not complaining too much." But I was like, if I'm going to survive, I need to switch my accent just a little bit. And so I did, but at the same time, I was learning how to preach. And so I started preaching in an American accent and started rolling my R's a little more and just sound a little bit more from down on the farm, you know. And I don't know, the wind changed or something because I can't get it back. And so I've kind of stuck with this sort of, I don't know, ugly twin sister of both New Zealand and American accents. And it's kind of
It's a curse. We cursed you.
or bless me, I don't know. It's somewhere in between. So I sound American to Kiwis, and I sound Kiwi to Americans, and I don't know. So that's kind of how that accent part of my story happened. But while I was in the States as well, I had a really good opportunity to take a look back on New Zealand from the outside. So I grew up in New Zealand, grew up in a Christian home, in a church, and I kind of, it's not that I assumed everyone was Christian. I just didn't think about it. You know, it just didn't enter my mind what the spiritual landscape of New Zealand was until I left and looked back. And of course, I came to the States, came to the Midwest, Bible Belt of America, you know, churches everywhere. Everyone seemed pretty engaged in church life. And then I looked back and I kind of went, we're not. Like, we just don't care about church. And so that's kind of where I think God started planting seeds of church planting. I knew church planters. In fact, I met Nate and Whitney Hutchison as they were embarking on a different church planting project to New Zealand. I'd sort of said, hey, God bless, be on your way. And then, so I saw church planters going to New Zealand, and it kind of occurred to me through a journey that God took me through. It didn't make sense for me to stay in America and be a pastor in a church in the States, which I actually really wanted to do. That sounded great to me. I loved the American church culture. I felt very accepted. My personality meshed well with that church culture. But it didn't make sense that I was staying and Americans were going back home to my people. So there's a little bit of it makes sense. I should go back to my people and to do something about this and to start churches there. So that's what got me started on that journey.
Wow. There's so many things. How long do we have?
I'm sorry, I do tell long stories.
No, that's good. That's what we want, because the more you talk, the less we do. So that's
right.
perfect.
Good point.
No, there's just so many things that kind of came to mind just while I was listening to you. The idea of culture and bridging across cultures and the part that plays in, missions, what it means to be a third culture. We've talked about third culture children. I'm from North Carolina. I lived in Costa Rica for 20 years. My daughter was born here. My wife is Costa Rican. So we're just a crazy mixture of, mess. The Hutchisons have talked about what it's like for them being North Americans, but their children having been born in New Zealand, and sort of the different struggles that come along with some of that. But when you said I sound like a Kiwi to the Americans and I sound like an American to the Kiwis, like, yeah, who are you? Do you know what I mean?
That's a deep question. I'm still answering that one.
Are you neither? Is that a disadvantage? Is it an advantage in some scenarios? I remember Nate saying at some point when we talked to him how sometimes it takes someone from outside the community speaking to the community to get the community's attention, something to that effect. And so, like, for you being from the community, but you can speak like someone from outside the community. So is that, in that case, is that an advantage, or is it just really confusing to people? It's just like, who is this guy?
Well, I think if I can speak to that there's two layers to that question. There's the theoretical layer. And I think we've discovered a lot of church planters coming from the States, or people coming from the States, have dealt with the theoretical level that New Zealand is not super friendly towards America as a concept. You know, we'll let that just be what it is. But so coming in sounding like an American is a disadvantage. And there's all this theory around, you know, how a New Zealand is going to treat Americans if you're coming in, and it doesn't seem like we're just, you know, coming in to tell New Zealanders how to do church because you can't do it very well, and come to rescue and the savior mentality and all of that sort of stuff, you know. And we sort of play around with that. And so I think Nate talked a little bit on the podcast about trying to shed some of that Americanism in order to fit into the New Zealand culture. And they've done an amazing job of that. They really embraced it. And so on that theoretical level, yes, my American sounding, I didn't like that, because our ace in the hole for the church plant team was that I was a Kiwi. I was a local. I was supposed to help us be accepted more. So that's the theoretical level. But on a practical level, when you start getting into a community of people and you just start talking one-on-one with people, those theories don't matter as much. This is what I've discovered. It really becomes down to who are you and who am I? And so when I tell my story, I'm accepted for my story or not accepted for my story, whatever the case may be. And the same goes for the Hutchisons, same goes for everybody. If I come in and I act like a stereotypical American, I will be treated as such. But if I come in as me, and if the me loves them, and if they feel like that there is love there, then it doesn't matter. In fact, there's oh, you're different. Hey, that's fun. Like, you get past that conversation very quickly in the relationship, and then it just gets down to who you are and who they are. So yes and no.
And that's just good practice anyway, right?
Yeah.
You know, just be genuine.
Because the worst thing is to come in and pretend to be local when everyone knows you're not.
That's not going to go.
It's not going to go. I mean, everyone knows who you are. I mean, you know, it's just.
No matter how much I say I'm Haitian, I am not Haitian.
No, not so much.
I can't imagine. Yeah. And you know, for me, that was it's been a struggle at times, because there have been moments when I'm just tired of being Will, the North American missionary. You know, and I'm very much a part of this community, and I'm confident that the community would echo that if there was a way for us to ask all of them collectively. You know, that has been affirmed for me over and over and over again. But even though I'm part of this community, I'll never not be Will from Eastern North Carolina.
No.
And so obviously for me to just pretend like I'm from here is ridiculous. But so it's this, I guess the struggle for me sometimes is what are the real limitations to how fully I can participate in the community that I'm not from. I can speak the language. I can sound like a Costa Rican when I'm talking. I can fool people for a while, but ultimately, I'm not from here.
Well, I agree with. I hear what you're saying, and I think the more we are authentic to who we are, the better off we're going to be in the relationships we have with people. So no, I'm never going to have no American influence in me. I'm an American woman. You know, I'm working with American people. That's okay. I'm not going to try and be that. I'm just going to be me. And God will use me as me in the area that he's put me in. So I don't have to try and be something more than that.
Hamish, that sounds pretty biblical, because when we're talking about a banquet table and what we can bring, like if we're talking about the great banquet of heaven, and that God created each of us in his own image, but because we are each created with our own unique gifts so that we can make the body whole. Like none of us are whole just by ourselves, but together as a group, as a community of believers, we are all invited to this banquet where we, as a part, can then become part of the whole. And so that sounds like if we do live into who God created us to be, we are living into our calling as believers.
Yeah, and I think this steps into the conversation, I'm guessing, between, trying to think of the right words, but between an embracing of a culture and an assimilating to a culture. So I think when we first came back to New Zealand, I first came with the church planning team, there wasn't a desire to assimilate to the culture. But what I think, if I can speak for Kiwis in this space, is that we would rather an embracing of the culture. Don't change who you are, just love who we are as well. Instead of trying to change who you are to become more like us, it's you as Americans come in and love being in New Zealand and taking on elements of being both American and Kiwi. I mean, Nate Whitney have got their New Zealand citizenship now. And what a beautiful statement that is to us as Kiwis, that they love this place and these people so much, they're going to plant their flag here and they're going to make this their home and take on that citizenship. But I would hate for them to give up their American citizenship in order to make that happen, because that's still who they are. And that's a beautiful part of who they are.
And we're all better if we're in the kind of relationship where I can love what is distinctly and uniquely you without necessarily denying what is uniquely and distinctly me. Obviously, if those things are harmful to one another, then that's something that we need to look at. But that it's not, and I've said this before, it's not about minimizing what is different and distinct about us so that it's just all vanilla.
Exactly.
And we just let's just all love Jesus and that's all that matters. No, we are intentionally, I think, intentionally by God created differently from one another in different contexts and cultures and all that kind of stuff. So it's a matter of coming to a table where you bring to the table what God intentionally made about you that's different from me, and I do the same thing, and that makes the table whole. And I think maybe what's been so damaging oftentimes in the kind of missions realm is that piece has been missing. And it's been about me going there to make them more like me because we get it right, and that's just terrible.
So it's a pendulum. We don't want to do that, but we also don't want to go there and make me like them.
Right.
Either.
Which is, because we're in both cases, we're denying the intentional uniqueness that we all bring to the table.
And another thing that comes to play with that is it really becomes about culture and nationality a lot. And so if I focus on the nationality differences between us, that's all it is. It's Kiwis and Americans. But really, that's only one facet of the differences and the similarities between us. There is, there's a racial culture. There is language. There is likes and dislikes, family backgrounds, all of these sort of things. There are points of similarity and points of differences in all of those areas. And so we can hyper-focus on the national, what flag I'm flying, as opposed to, this is who I am. This is how God made me. This is my history, my background. These are the things I've done well. These are the things I've done badly. This is me. Who are you? Let's connect.
So if I put you on the spot and made you the spokesman for New Zealand, and
I don't think they would like that. I think if there was a vote, I would lose. But
they don't have a choice. It's our podcast, so I get to do that.
So, I'm sorry, New Zealand. Here we go.
What is it that if you had to make up a list right now, I'm putting you on the spot of what are the things that you think I need or that I will be made better because you are bringing to the table? What are the characteristics
Kiwis are bringing to the table?
That are unique and distinct from me. And so in order to complete me, I need to learn these things from you. If we narrowed it more and said, what are the things that members of First Methodist Church Shreveport can learn from members of Church Northwest?
Okay. It's difficult too, because I speak without knowing the details of Shreveport and that sort of thing. So
you've been here for 5 days,
and I haven't. I shook a lot of hands, and I still haven't picked it up. I don't know. I think one of the things that New Zealanders bring to the table that perhaps Americans can learn from, this is where I'm going to start, is humility. And that is a huge value of Kiwis, is if you come into it guns blazing, I know everything, I'm right. Not saying that all Americans do that, but there's a value in America of swagger, of confidence, and that's a beautiful thing. So it's not a bad thing in and of itself, but Kiwis come with humility. We don't toot our own horns. We try to. I mean, we're a small country, so we're used to being the underdog. So we kind of value that. So that would be something that we can bring to the table that helps people come together. Is if we come with humility, we're more likely to hear the other person. If we come with confidence and we're right, then great. If we come with confidence and we're wrong, then it's a mess. So that would be one thing.
That's a really good one.
Thank you.
That was in my dissertation.
Ah, well, there you go.
And here we go, pointing back to the Bible again. I mean, that's it's a pretty important characteristic of the Savior that we follow, and something that has come up. There's some words that I've realized as I go back and listen to these episodes and continue to edit and get things ready to be published. There's some words that keep coming up over and over and over again, regardless of who we're talking to. And, we've talked to people from New Zealand. We've talked to a friend from Cambodia. We talked to a friend in Kenya. We talked to a friend in El Salvador. And there's certain words, in spite of how different all of those contexts are and different directions that the conversation has gone, there's certain words that keep coming up over and over again. And we keep coming back to relationship. We keep coming back to partnership and companionship. And to me, for any of those three things, if those really are important to ministries thriving, there has to be humility in any of that. Because what kind of a relationship, if there's not humility, it's not going to be a healthy relationship. Right. How can you be a companion to someone if you really understand what the word companion means, if you're not doing it with a humble heart? So I think it's a wonderful characteristic to be able to say, this is what we bring to the table. This is one of the things that we can bring to the table, is a spirit of humility. I think that's wonderful.
Well, if I can sort of step back into more of a strategic context type space, talking theology, right? But just the way that the church is operated, especially in the Western world, if I can use the term Western world, is we have lived in a state of spiritual dominance. Christianity has been the dominant force in society for many years. And in New Zealand, we have discovered, and I think Nate brought up the term post-Christian, and in Europe and in many parts of the States as well and other places around the world, that there's a moving past, that it's no longer a dominant force. It is now a minority place. And so the confidence and the swagger and the authoritativeness that accompanied a dominant church, that did good things in its culture because it was in that position. And I don't want to diminish those things. Paul was those things. So there's a place for that. But I think that time is passing. And I think having a humble approach to relationships and to truth and to still holding truth, but the way we present truth, the way that we communicate the gospel story to people with humility fits perhaps better now as it did in the first century church. So we are able now to look at the first century church in the book of Acts and some of those people and recognize some of those attributes in the way that they loved and they cared for and they silently and subversively spread the word as opposed to openly and loudly and dominantly. And so that this attitude that we have as Kiwis, being underdogs, being the small country, being the small people, as many other countries around the world, I imagine Costa Rica would have similar sort of ways of thinking as well, that perhaps America hasn't been able to have because it is the big superpower in the world, and so that comes with its own attributes, So we are able to sort of present this as actually the way that the church needs to operate in the coming years, and the way that the church is changing, the way that the position of the church in society has changed, we are now the minority. We must approach this in this way, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
I often talk about the Constantine threshold, which is that same concept. The point at which Christianity switched from minority to majority.
Yeah.
And in New Zealand, I know we've gone back past the threshold again into minority. And I think this is the encouragement I've given to churches in the States that I've spoken to, is to either prepare for or admit that the threshold has either come or is coming.
Yeah.
And to be able to adjust the way that we communicate the gospel and the way that we, just the entire attitude that we have in mission and gospel and evangelism, whatever you want to call it, needs to shift with that understanding.
Mm-hmm. I was going to jump in, but he looks like he's going to.
He's stroking his beard like he's got there's a seed growing in his mind, and it's.
I'm just trying to decide how far off the rails to go.
Well, that's always a dangerous question.
Here's what I was going to say. My little adding to this is another book that I love is Dwayne Elmer's Cross-Cultural Servanthood. And the whole thrust of that book is serving with Christ-like humility, which is what we've been talking about, the humble nature of how Christ served and how can we embody that. And his whole push is that when we're acting in this superiority and arrogance, when we're going in acting like we know things and we're going in pushing our own agenda, we take away the humanity of those that we're sitting across from. We treat them like a project. And these are things I've said before. We treat them like a project. We treat them as if they have no identity and as if they have nothing to bring to the table. So we have to switch that mentality around and treat people like people and treat people as though they are made in God's image and as though they do have something to add. And it going the one step further is asking what they have to teach us. And that's kind of the emphasis of everything that we've been trying to do with this podcast of how do we change the mindset of the local church, of the average person going and serving in our local or global community, and how do we get them to realize that they're going out to learn and to grow as opposed to going out to fix someone or something.
I think part of that is when we are talking to people who have grown up in a culture like America's, and everyone always assumes negative things will follow that statement, but America has been at the top of the world for so long now, and done some really good things in that position. I have to say that. I know many of my country people would just like to point out the faults, but there have been some good things as well. And God has used the States and is still using the States. I mean, we are being supported almost entirely by American churches who believe in spreading the word around the world, and New Zealand churches are not there yet. So there's some great things that are happening. But for individuals living in that culture, it's very hard to shift that dominant mentality. And it's hard for us to expect them to just do that. So I think a lot of that comes with grace and with compassion for the people of America, that it's going to take time and it's going to take effort on their part to shift those mentalities, and we can sort of slap them across the wrist for being arrogant, but they're products of the culture that they're from, on an individual level.
So since you brought it up, one of the things that we're really hoping to accomplish is helping people rethink what missional relationships mean.
Yes.
From between a local church and either a missionary or a missionary family, or with the community where the missionaries are serving. So can you talk a little bit about what those kinds of relationships look like in your case? Maybe obviously you don't have to name names, but have there been some of those relationships where it just feels like everything's clicking and everybody gets it, and then have there been some others where that's not so much the case and you've had to sort of struggle through? How do we manage a relationship where their expectations and our reality aren't really matching up?
do you just walk away from them, or do you figure out a way to learn together and grow together and come to the same table?
Sure. I will preface this by admitting that I am at heart a task-orientated person. So I would disagree
Oh
based
no,
on what
I've
I
had
know.
to learn.
Okay. Well, I am a task-orientated person. I don't consider that completely negatively, but the relational concepts of things are a little more foreign to me than the task of things. I resonate with the Great Commission. I resonate with those things of the go and the do. And that's why I partner with people like Nate, who can bring me back into that relationship and really spearhead that. So that's going to influence what I'm saying. But I've also noticed that there's in talking with people, like I don't have a church like First United that is as engaged in the abiding side of the mission relationship. I mean, most of my churches, they support us, they love us, they send us money, and that's that. We send them reports when we're back in the States. We visit them. I've not had many of them even sort of explore mission trips to New Zealand. We've kind of steered them away from that path because it tends to not be beneficial for either party, really.
Mm-hmm.
So most of my churches are that. I know another friend who has churches of a different denominational group that is much more engaged, but on a contractual style basis. So he has far fewer churches than I do. I have something like 10 or 12 churches that support me at small amounts. They have only a few churches, and they sort of sponsor him. And so they sign a contract with them, and that is very engaged, and there's high accountability and all of that sort of stuff. So for me, the way that I think about the relationship with my church is it's almost like the sweet spot. I don't feel as engaged and supported and loved on an ongoing basis, but I also don't feel like I've got someone looking over my shoulders.
Sure.
So there's a sweet spot, and that's why I mentioned the task orientated thing, because as a task orientated person, I like that. I like that people are engaged with what's going on. I tell them what's happening. They may ask a few questions, but they're not trying to run or control or fit what the work that's happening into their expectations, what it should be. On the relational side, they also don't provide much of that either, and that's fine with me because that's not my, I'm just going to go and do, and my relationships are close to the people that I have in my circle. So I don't know how exactly to answer the question, really, in that sense of how do I work through that relationship. Really, it's not a strong relationship between the supporting church and the church and us. There's love there. I don't want to diminish that. There is care. There is, we want to see you succeed, and that is expressed through the checks that are written faithfully month in and month out. And that would be that.
Yeah, so that I was going to ask another question related to that. What do you hope just a normal member of one of those churches, when they're putting their tithe in the collection plate, or when it's stewardship Sunday and they're talking about budgeting, and they know somehow or another on their radar is part of our church's budget goes towards supporting these church planters in New Zealand. What do you hope that means to the person that's writing that check? And here's why I'm asking this question, and I don't know if there's anything here, but it's about a 2.5 hour flight from San Jose, Costa Rica to Miami, right? So we have 40 or so volunteer teams a year from partner churches who come down here and work with us. So there's constant back and forth. There's constant physical contact between our ministry and the churches that support us. I'm back and forth on a regular basis. And I realize, obviously, that's not the case for everybody. So one of the things that I'm sort of trying to get my head around is recognizing that it's not the same for everybody. It's not the same for every missionary. It's not the same for every supporting church. But I think it needs to be important, regardless of how much or how little physical contact there is, for the people who are paying the bills.
There's a triangle of relationships that happen when someone supports someone else. And I learned this from a book I read that I can't remember the name of, but I really like that. It's a connection that happens between the supporter, the supportee, and God. And what I've really resonated with, and what I've tried to impress upon people when I've asked for support and when we've gone through that process, is that they are not supporting me as much as they are worshiping and honoring God. And God is the one who is asking them to engage in this activity, and then God is supporting me. So of the three sides of that triangle, and again, this may sound terrible, the relationship between me and the supporter is the least important of the three relationships. So, and so this sounds like I'm kind of going against all of the things that you're talking about. But for me, on the other side of the world, okay, I'm going to say this and it's going to sound terrible, but please take it with a grain of salt. It's like I am focused on what God is asking me to do in my place with my people. If I've got a community of people in the States who are supporting that, that is beautiful and it's wonderful and it's fantastic. But if I have to spend a lot of time and effort engaging and building the relationship with them, as a person who is not a relational person by nature, it is going to detract from the relationships that I'm trying to build in my place where God has called me to work. So what I want, when you ask that question, what do I want for that person who is putting their money in the tithe? What I want is for them to be acting in worship of God, and that relationship grows stronger. That they're listening and that their communication with God grows to the point where God is either asking them to give and forget, which is a real thing, or to give and engage. That's between them and God. So God is building them and building their faith and building their conviction through that act of giving. And then at the same time, God is building my faith and he is building my reliance on him through that act of relying and being supported by him, and him supporting me and providing those funds for me, so that I can then focus on what I'm being called to do in New Zealand. And it sounds very compartmentalized, and it sounds very like I'm just going to focus on my thing and you don't worry about your thing. But in my mind, there is that element that God is using his chess pieces all around the world to achieve his purposes, what he wants to achieve. And so the queen does not necessarily have to have a connection with the pawn for there to be a godly connection happening, if that makes sense, because the chess player is connected to both. And so that would be a way that I would look at missions in some way. Not for everybody. Again, Nate would shrivel and die into that sort of mentality because the support that he receives from the people giving money to him empowers him. It engages him. As a task-oriented person, I'm enhanced and engaged by being able to do the thing God has asked me to do. Does that make sense?
Thank you. Yes. No, that's fantastic. Thank you so much for the way that you express that, because I think to me the most exciting thing about all of that is what it does is to some degree disconnects the giver from this sort of end like product,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Which and Ashley talks a lot about getting away from transactional missions. And so if I just have to, as the giver, have to put a blindfold on and drop the check in the bucket and pray that God is going to use that so that you, who I may never have contact with, can plant a Christian community in New Zealand, then I mean that to an extreme level avoids all of those problems that come along with I'm saving this child's life, or I'm doing this, or I'm doing that, right? And
or
instead
it's to say it has to be done a certain way.
I am faithfully contributing to the work that God is doing in the world and trusting that God is doing the work in the world, which may be does mean that this podcast has just come to an end, and faithful friendship and relationship building.
I've broken it. Awesome.
You broke the broken banquet.
The broken banquet.
Oh my gosh. This is, and I mean, I think I'm reflecting too, and as I sort of do ministry for a while, I learn there are different ways that people approach these things and different personalities. And I was listening to one of the other podcasts that you guys were doing, and I can't remember the exact points. This is going to sound like a rambling, but there was this relationship-based thing where, I want to engage with that person. I want to abide with that person. I want to, be with that person. Also needs to reflect what that person actually wants and needs. And so there are people who, the introverts of the world, are like in fetal positions in the corner, thinking about the concept of abiding with all of these different people. It's scary, whereas, they have their genius is somewhere else and their strength is somewhere else. So it helps us to kind of like, okay, we want to do these things. We want to be engaged, but we also want to make sure that God is over this and he's putting us where we need to be, which is why I think there's this beautiful connection between Shreveport and Nate and Whitney, and that you guys are life affirming and so giving towards them in a way that makes sense to them, in a way that builds them up. And while I really would love to have gone to Italy as well, I'm just kidding. But there's like the way that you would relate to me would be different, because, if and I've had some connections with people like, okay, I got to meet with them every month and I got to shift gears. Like, okay, I'm in my space, I'm in my circle, I'm very much what is in front of me is what I deal with, and then I got to switch gears back to what's happening in somewhere else and tend that relationship and work on that relationship. And you don't want to sound cold and bitter, but God has called me to do this thing here,
Well, and if I can speak to that, because our relationship at First United Methodist Church is different with, I think, every single partner that we have.
Yeah.
And
Right.
it's based on the partner, not on us. It's based on the partner. And that's something that we had to teach here at the church, that it was not a one shop fits all, one relationship fits all. There's some relationships where when we go visit, there is a purpose to that visit. Like there needs to be small group leader training. There needs to be something that my church family can add to your church family. And that's what we are coming to do. When I tell people of our church that if they want to go and build something and actually hold a hammer, then that means that we go see Will and we engage in this project when we can, then he can teach them of what it means to actually have a relational ministry as well, so that they can get both worlds and then come back. So there has to be the balance, because we are all individuals and we all need something different from this relationship. So we have, as a leader on the mission side of things, on the church side of things, I have to be cognizant of that and treat it as such.
You know what it takes to be able to recognize that? Humility. Because otherwise, if you say this is what mission relationships must look like, then you're not taking into account at all where the other person is, on any level. So,
and I think the beautiful thing that happens there too is when people are engaged with in their space, they will actually move closer to your space in that. So for me, if I'm not forced into like abiding all of the time, I'm going to want to abide some of the time, and I'm like working with Nate. This is a beautiful example because he is different from me. And we've taken on a co-leadership avenue, which in the first church plant, I was more of the authoritative leader. And this time I'm forced to meet him halfway. And it's a beautiful thing for me because I am task oriented and he's teaching me to become people orientated in some ways, and I'm hopefully teaching him to sort of, knuckle down and do something every now and then, which is not fair. He does plenty of great stuff. But no. But it's like, there's a different ways of approaching things. And so we meet each other halfway if we're not forcing the other person to meet us all the way, And so when we come and meet them, where are you at? They're actually going to respond by coming to where you're at as well, and it becomes mutually beneficial.
Yeah. Ooh, mutually beneficial. Mutually beneficial. That's another one of my phrases.
Yeah, no, I'm just thinking about what a healthy relationship it is to be able to say to someone, you'll never know how much I value you as a partner and as a companion, and the fact that you leave me alone.
Yeah.
Instead of trying to squeeze something out of this that's going to be incredibly unnatural for me and unproductive, and ultimately is going to result in my trying to create space between you and myself, and then there's no more companionship.
Yeah.
Sorry, Will, I'm still going to hug you every time I see you.
Oh my God. See, I try. I mean, these really subtly, I try and kind of.
Why do you think he's down in Costa Rica?
Exactly.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And that's one of the things I've really appreciated about what God has given me and the supporters that I have. Is that basically is what it is. It's a, we love you and we're going to let you go and do what you're going to do.
Yeah.
Can I still come see you?
Absolutely.
Okay.
100%. Well, this is the thing. I mean, it's not forced. It's a, and you do go, this is different too, because the way that Shreveport loves people is actually very life-giving anyway. If you did it every 3 months, it would not be. But the way that you come and you're rest giving and life giving, that's a beautiful thing. You really need that. But I couldn't have 10 churches like that. If I had 10 Shreveports supporting me, I would do nothing. Nothing would get done. I'd be building relationships with my supporting churches the whole time.
Yeah, you would just abide all the time.
Yeah, I'd just be abiding. I'd just sit on my couch and just talk to people, which maybe my lazy part of my personality likes that. But the responsibility part kind of screams that you need to do something.
But there's a huge difference in like what Ashley just said. Can we still come and see you and saying, hey, now don't forget next spring I'm coming down with the missions board, and make sure you got all your everything in order, your presentation ready, because we really need to analyze how productive this relationship is. And
there's a difference, a life-giving or a life-taking.
Yeah. When Costa Rica first opened up again after we sort of got over the hump of the pandemic, and teams started reaching out to us again about, can we come back and what can we do and what do you have going on, and yes, they could come back. There was not much going on,
right?
And so my answer was, it would be really nice if like 4 or 5 of you wanted to just come and spend a few days just kind of hanging out, come see how everybody's doing, all, our staff and the people that here, come and see with your own eyes that we're doing all right, and take that back with you to the church. Like that is life-giving, right? But the thought of having a group of 30 volunteers coming into that scenario just because they had all missed us a lot and were ready to go, that it would have been a disaster.
Right.
So there has to be that kind of honesty in these relationships to be able to say, we love you, this is what we need from you, rather than feeling like anything you throw at us, we have to take it and say thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that also, when you're treated that way and you're given that freedom, God has space in our hearts on the mission field to open ourselves up to bring people out so that God can work on their hearts. And I think there is a give and take relationship there that is possible, where on the mission field we can give experiences to people that will engage them in missions themselves, that they won't get in a classroom back at home. So there is that as well, and I recognize that. And it's, we kind of say, oh, don't bring missions teams out, because there's nothing for them to do, and that's pretty true. But also, I think there's room for, in my heart, to open up and say, you know what, maybe this one's not about us. Maybe this one's about them. And maybe we can do it in a way that it's not 500 people, because that's just ridiculous. But maybe 10 people who the church has said, I really think something could be sparked in these people. Can we bring them out and show them what's up?
Ashley, do you have a list of 10 questions?
Ooh, no, I don't, but I can make them up.
Well, we always, apparently, we always forget to ask people, what's the most challenging thing about what you do? So would you like to share that with us? What's the most challenging thing about being a church planter in New Zealand?
I think the most challenging thing for me is to find, the momentum's not the word, but fruit in outreach type relationships. It just takes so long. It's just, there's so much of it just seems like I'm doing nothing and going nowhere. And so having the faith and the patience to not shift things up or to try something else, but to just continue to plod away in an attitude of loving and caring for people, which again, I'm task orientated, so this is hard for me. Come on, let's see some results here. Why aren't you a Christian yet? If I don't baptize a certain number of people per month, I'm failing. So that's trying to get myself into that mentality of the long game and of just and being relational, because that's what we need, and I know we need that, and it's not my personality, so that's hard for me. I think that's my personal biggest challenge. From a church, I think, it's just breaking into that culture. I mean, we've got Christians at our church, and they're growing, and it's wonderful. But just getting them engaged and getting out into the community and trying to bring Christ relationships into the community, and introduce people to Jesus. It's simple. It's really hard because people don't think they need it. And you got to be very careful in the way you go about it and all of that. So,
wow. Thank you.
Is there anything you wish that we had asked you?
No, actually. There's nothing burning on my heart that I really want. Usually it would have come out already. I say what's on my...
Who's your favorite rugby team?
Oh, gosh. Okay, so my favorite rugby team, for those listening who don't know what rugby is, it's a wonderful game. It's a beautiful game. It's New Zealand's national sport. And so I like the All Blacks, which is the national team. I have to like them. It's if I get kicked out if I don't support them. But there's a local team in Wellington where I was born and raised, the Wellington Hurricanes. I was only 7 years old when I left Wellington, but it's still home. And so I always sort of root for them when I can.
This is one of the best conversations we've ever had.
Oh, you say that.
It was a really good one.
I bet you tell that to all the missionaries.
First time I've said it.
Well, I appreciate it. I'm honored to be a part of this. I know you guys very, very smart people. I know you think very deeply and well about missions, and I appreciate that. I appreciate that you treat me as if I have something to say. So thank you.
No way. This has been really, really good. This has been a good, easy conversation, and that's helpful. What we really wanted this to be is just us kind of hanging out and talking about stuff that's important to us with people that are important to us, and we appreciate you being willing to be a part of it and taking time out of your rest time while you're there to do this. I hope it didn't.
I was being lazy today, and I did have to come and do this. So, yeah, that's
sorry.
Sorry.
It is my absolute pleasure. I love being able to talk through this sort of stuff. And, when you're on the mission field and you're doing, sometimes it's nice to sit back and think about what you're doing, and to talk to people about, the theory behind it and what's important. It's convicting me. I listened to some of the podcasts you guys have done, and I've had my convictions and like, oh yeah, this is going to be hard for me, but this is important. So I appreciate what you guys do.
Well, thank you. Thank you for being a part of it.
Thanks, Hamish.
My pleasure.
All right. I'll see you guys. When are we going to New Zealand, Ashley?
When would you like?
Tomorrow. Well, no, tomorrow. I'm not
You
going to
won't
be there.
Well, every time I listen to that interview with Hamish, it just gets better and better and better. And I even sent it to Hamish so he could listen to it. And we talked about how many things we still want to talk about. So I can't wait to get him back on the podcast so that we can talk more about reciprocal relationships and the Maori culture and reaching across the cultural lines to for that abiding relationship. So we need Hamish back on the podcast.
I think we need Hamish and Nate together back on the podcast.
Ooh, that would be so exciting. Both of them together. I don't know if our listeners could handle it.
I think we should try. We should at least give them the chance.
Okay. Well, then, to be continued.
You heard it here first, folks. Hamish and Nate not part 2, because there hasn't been a Hamish and Nate part 1. We're going to have Hamish and Nate on the Broken Banquet podcast.
Stay tuned. You've been listening to The Broken Banquet, a podcast by Will Bailey and Ashley Goad. Music provided by Irene and the Sleepers. Join us next week for another episode. He's prepared the table. All things are ready. Come to the feast.